please. So our next speaker is Christopher Yu. I'd like to have invite up, and he'll be talking about another interesting dimension of the future of the internet, especially in the U.S. Christopher.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Among my many hats I wear, I actually have a secondary appointment in the computer science department where I also teach. And we're trying to build a major interdisciplinary initiative built on the premise that lawyers and policymakers need to understand the technology a lot better. What's been interesting to me in the part of this presentation is there are aspects of the policymaking world and the economic side of this that technologists need to understand better. And so I'm grateful to Tony for inviting me and thinking that what I had to say might be helpful. So, why are we worried about the common carriage debate? Well, for those of you who don't fully know this, for a long time, and I'm framing it in terms of the 2010 order, but it goes back well into the mid-90s, the FCC in the United States has adopted a very different approach to internet regulation than pretty much every other country in the world. The standard operating procedure in most of the world is to fold the internet into the existing regulatory regime that governs telephone networks. And that, in fact, the U.S. has decided not to do that and has tried to develop new rules fashioned for the distinctive and different technological and economic contexts that characterize the internet. And that was instantiated last 2010 in an order where the FCC was trying to pursue a light touch version of regulation of the open internet, not based on telephone regulation or common carriage regulation, presenting three rules. Those rules were overturned in January of 2014. Well, as you probably are aware of, in November, the FCC has been trying to figure out what to do ever since, and the president made a speech actually proposing to fold the open internet initiative into the traditional regime that governs telephones. And that's what we know as common carriage regulation, the standard, the classic formulation of common carriage regulation. And I must confess, what I'm going to describe to you about the proposed FCC order is rumors. They're going to vote on it on February 26th. There is a draft circulating with the FCC. Like all agencies, it leaks. This is my best. I got it on pretty good authority that this is what it says, but until you actually see what it says, you never really know. But the classic formulation of common carriage is that rates be just, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. The proposal is seriously considering extending what are the privacy regulations that apply to telephone companies. They're called CP&I rules to the internet, and to regulate the internet for disability access, and that they would forbear from all other provisions. Actually, at the last, they are talking about doing something much different. Well, my last slide, they're also talking about regulating interconnection among internet providers, which would be a major step. And what's fascinating to me is there's actually in Congress proposed legislation to return to the 2010 order and to try to figure out that apparently is going nowhere because they need, the Republican Senate particularly needs a few Democrats to support the initiative. And the White House is making very clear they have no interest in working with the Republicans to form a compromise, even though everyone says actually having a clear a legislative solution would be a lot clearer because the order was struck down because the agency tried to do too much, and this would do something that Congress hadn't authorized, and that would eliminate that problem. So this is why this is important. And so what's fascinating to me is when we look at common carriage, it's often talked about as this sort of golden era baseline. And what's striking to me is when you look at the literature, people didn't think it worked that well to begin with. Particularly starting in the 60s and 70s, there was an enormous critique. And there have been several attempts by people who support the regulatory intervention to try to understand it. And they've come up with a bunch of syntheses. And I would have to say that they're largely unsatisfactory because historically, if you look at the roots of common carriage, they're very odd. So at common law, it wasn't just network industries. It affected a wide variety of institutions, warehouses, grain elevators, things we wouldn't normally think of as stuff that's traditionally regulated. And what's fascinating is in the U.S., we tried to figure out what determined what group of industries fell within this. The formulation latched on by the Supreme Court was an industry that was affected with a public interest. They used that test to say that housing was an industry affecting the public interest, banking, fire insurance, textile manufacturing, and ice distribution. And it's fascinating. None of us would think of rate regulating housing in the same sort of way, although we do things with rent control in certain situations. But what the Supreme Court finally did in the 1930s is they rejected this test as as not providing a closed class or category of business. They said it's not susceptible of definition. And this actually died a very untimely death in the 1930s and has been reaffirmed a bunch of times. So I don't think anyone really believes that we can learn very much by looking at the historical roots of what common carriage meant and get much meaningful out of it. What's interesting also is the most modern things. Some people attempted to say that, oh, it's connected somehow to transportation and communications. Well, the funny thing is, it's a problematic definition because we do common carriage style regulation to a lot of things that are neither transportation nor communications, such as gas, electric power, and water. We actually do have a number of sectors in transportation and communications, such as buses, trucks, and up to this point, the internet, which have been immune. So, I mean, this has not been considered a very satisfactory historical synthesis. So the question is, can we do something better? The modern reconstruction of common carriage regulation is to focus on industries that are natural monopolies. These are ones that, even if they start off as competitive businesses, there's only going to be one survivor, and they would eventually collapse back into monopolies. And we all know the monopolies, they charge too much, and that's the classic problem. They produce too little, and so it leads to a very standard justification for rate regulation. And historically, one of the problems you have with rate regulation is if you're part of a rate-regulated business and a non-rate regulated business, you can tie the two products together and make up whatever you lose from rate regulation by charging extra for the unregulated business. And so, in fact, what goes hand in hand with rate regulation is some form of line of business restriction that keeps companies only to the businesses that are rate regulated, and anyone who lived through the breakup of AT&T knows this full well. So what's fascinating to me is there was a huge academic and regulatory critique of common carriage and the problems it presented that grew in the 60s. And actually, there was a competitive carrier initiative in the FCC and a regulatory alternatives that came out of the NTIA that laid out a whole bunch of criticisms of why this wasn't such a great idea. And in fact, what we have to think of is one of the ways that policymakers now think of things is as comparative second bests. We used to think, oh, there's a problem, the government should go fix it. We now recognize that the government fix will also fall short of perfection because all human institutions do. And the real question is, which, even among two second best outcomes or imperfect outcomes, which is better and which leads to the better outcome? So let's talk about this. If we have to compare the unregulated situation with the regulated situation. Well, the unregulated situation doesn't perform that great. So the optimal result from an economic standpoint is to price things at marginal cost. That generally happens when you have competitive businesses. For reasons I'm happy to discuss with you in Q&A or in the hallways, that cannot happen in high fixed cost industries. It's a very well-recognized economic truism, and monopoly sets prices too high. Well, what happens if it's not a monopoly? What happens if it's an oligopoly? Oligopoly sets prices that are lower than monopoly, but still higher than competitive levels. It's somewhere in the intermediate case in between. And so, in fact, we end up with a world where the empirical evidence strongly suggests, and this is from economic studies, is that the vast majority of price reductions happen with the entry of the second and third firm. And you can see why why antitrust authorities routinely approve mergers from 4-firm industries to 3-firm industries, because in general, the price effects are mostly captured by that, and that's more or less reflected in modern competition policy. That's what happens to the non-regulation side. It's in a world where we have some competition, but limited competition, we do better than monopoly, but not as good as perfect competition. What do we do on the regulatory intervention side? Well, there are a bunch of in the FCC and the NTIA orders, they discovered a bunch of downsides to the common carriage regime. First, the direct costs are quite high, both the compliance costs, the accounting rules you have to follow, but in fact, the technical disintegration required by the structural separation requirements. There's a very nice article by an MIT economist that looked at a series of things imposed by common carriage regulation and estimated the losses in the billions annually because we couldn't do things like vertical switching services and other things back in the days of the computer inquiries. And there is a theory, an economic theory of what the optimal size of a firm is, and if you're regulating structural separation, you're obviously changing that, and there's going to be some costs associated with that. The next ones are actually, I think, much more subtle and much more interesting. So one of the fascinating things about, recall that common carriage regulation requires rates that are just, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. We found out that non-discriminatory is remarkably hard to enforce. No, non-discriminatory means charging the same for the same product. But the problem is, well, first, what happens if you say, well, it's really a different product? And this, what you'll find is that what I take from this is things like natural gas and water and electricity, where the dimensions of product quality are very narrow, this works pretty well. But when you have extremely sophisticated products, it tends not to work very well. The second problem is it's not discriminatory if it costs you different amounts. And you're allowed to charge different prices if the costs are different. If you have different production technologies, you're going to get into constant fights over whether different prices are justified by different costs, and you can see different utilization patterns based on the peaks. You're going to have different costs, and as we know, they're hard to meter, so you're always going to have some form of proxy because of the burstiness of the traffic. And there's a basic problem that, it's going to be causing a lot of arguments, and we discovered this even in the pre-internet days with voice and other things. The other problem is you're not just going to regulate price. You're going to have to get involved in the non-price terms. I mean, the classic thing is, okay, fine, I'll give you the price you're looking for. You just have to give me 90-day notice of any changes. Or you have to, my favorite one back in the days of the Telecommunications Act of 96 is a person came in and said, was working in a colo space, and the incumbent asked him, well, where are you going? He says, I'm going to use the bathroom. And the incumbent said, I'm sorry, there's nothing in the FCC order that says I have to use the bathroom. And in fact, we should expect this. These are at least one of these parties is an unwilling participant in the business relationship. They will comply with the law the way you and I pay taxes. We will do what we're required to do, but don't expect us to be volunteering anything more. And in fact, there is now an order in the FCC that says, yes, you have to let them go to the bathroom. And I say that sort of as a joke, but what we found in these relationships is that they're constantly, especially when the interface is complex, you're going to have a whole bunch of different dimensions where you're going to be asking to set parameters. And so we've discovered when that happens, non-discrimination is relatively hard to do. Now let's talk about the just and reasonable part. This is the size of the price. Well, just to give you a couple quotes, the Supreme Court found that this is very, very hard to do. So normally, how do we set value? The classic valuation would be is you look at a market-based transaction of a similar basis, a similar parallel transaction. The problem is these industries are not competitive, and whatever prices they have are in fact the product of regulation themselves likely. You can't do that. It's basically a circular problem where you're not going to get anything out of it. The second thing you can do is look at market capitalization. How much could you earn through that? But again, that's largely derivative of the prices that are set. And so you're left to the last valuation technique, which is you look at cost. You count up how much it would cost to make and allow a fair return on that. Now, here's the whole problem. Costs, this whole slide is about how hard it is to implement cost-based rate regulation in an effective way. So first is, you're going to argue about, the easy one, what's the rate of return you're allowed to earn on your investment? And this is in a world where tenths of a difference in rates of return means huge amounts to people's bottom lines. That's a problem. The second is, what are you allowed to earn a return on? And we get into this wonderful argument about whether we measure things in terms of replacement cost versus historical cost, whether investments are what they call prudent, that is, are we just going to allow you to earn a return on everything you invest in, or are we just going to look at the things that were really a good idea? The problem with there is then you end up with huge hindsight bias problems because you're trying to say, oh, that was obviously a bad investment. Well, that becomes an enormous problem because we've never solved that. The other problem with cost-plus regimes is they're inflationary. You're allowed to earn a return with anything you can plausibly say was prudent at the time, and we discovered that, in fact, that didn't give you any incentive to reduce costs. But also, you've got a nice guaranteed return. Why will you innovate in process? Why would you innovate in product? And there's a vibrant debate in the economic literature, does common carriage regulation impede innovation? And in fact, there's some theories that suggest actually it promotes it, and that's an interesting set of common questions we can have. Allocation of common costs is an enormous problem because the idea is you would allocate all of them to the regulated company, earn a guaranteed rate of return on that, and then use your unregulated company with a common cost to underprice the competition, largely through regulatory arbitrage, not because you're doing anything better in the market. There's a wonderful literature based around Averich and Johnson that says that there's a systematic bias to over-invest in capital-intensive solutions and disinvest in operating cost-oriented solutions. And here's the other problem, is that common carriage regulation runs afoul of the need of multiple classes of service. And so, in fact, what we found is when you regulate businesses instead of residences in particular, they need very different things. I don't need A, I need less of A and more of B, but in fact, we have a set number of pots. And so in that world, in fact, it would not end, you would have different classes of service that would essentially allow you to do pay-for-play discrimination. Now, the solution among the DC advocates of common carriage is we'll only have one class of service. And anyone who runs a network saying, well, there's some problems with that. It'll be oriented towards the least common denominator customer, and people who can't find or looking for different aspects out of the service won't be able to get it and won't even be able to use the functionality and the solutions that we've built into the network today. So the other problem, and this is very rarely discussed, is common carriage was very heavily criticized for facilitating collusion. So what do you need for collusion? Well, in fact, you would have to get permission in a common carriage world before you entry, and entry protection is always good for protecting incumbents. You have to standardize products, which is actually a nice homogenized product, becomes very easy to organize a cartel around. The more complex the product is, the harder it is. It allows you to pool information, which is something that should always raise competition policy concerns. You have to give advance notice of all changes. And in fact, they're going to not just regulate costs, they say you can't give hidden price cuts because that's a way to do backdoor discrimination. And that in fact, what we discover is that is one of the most important ways we destabilize cartels is by people cheating on the price in ways that aren't visible, and that in fact you'll then have the government enforcing particular prices, because one of the other problems you have with a cartel is the lack of an enforcement authority. In this world, the government will do a very nice job of doing it in a classic common carriage world. I should say, by the way, there is a whole different approach to this called price caps. I have some writing on this. They were promised to sell the world, oh, this will solve all our problems. What we discover is price caps, one, were based on cost-based information for the first baseline. And second is they didn't deliver on the promise that they thought they would. The prices didn't necessarily go down. And more importantly, what we found is regulators were going in after the fact and playing games with the price caps that in fact, your return was supposed to be fixed. And so anything you saved, you were allowed to keep. And that's supposed to give you the incentives to economize. What inevitably happened was the regulator saying, oh, you saved money, you're doing better than we thought you would. Guess what? You don't get to keep it. And in fact, they would move the ball. And one of the huge problems we have with price caps is you can't actually get a credible commitment not to do that from the government. And it's very, very hard to do. Now, this is all the theoretical critique. I wanted to throw up a couple slides that in many ways are a useful comparison, but I will admit not a perfect comparison. One of the interesting things is that, as I said, the rest of the world has been doing common carriage regulation. So an interesting benchmark for us to predict what might happen if we did common carriage regulation is to look at what would happen and what's happened in the rest of the world. And this has been very hard to do. Most of the data we have is about subscription data, not deployment data. And that's a problem because what we're finding from the studies is the barriers to adoption aren't just price and availability. In fact, they often rank 3, 4, 5 down the list. It's more technical ability, or actually, oddly enough, many people think they don't need it. They don't need broadband. And what's fascinating to me is I hear people say, oh, if people just want to live in caves and be primitive, it's one thing. But I mean, if you're trying to create a real change in the world, this is a real problem because that's what the real non-adopters are telling us. By the way, there's a wonderful study by 2 FCC staffers and a company called Connected Nation that does rural build-outs. They did a survey of broadband non-adopters and asked why they aren't adopting. 2/3 would not adopt even if it were free. And so that is a real problem. So what do we want to see? We want to look at deployment data. The problem with that is it's very hard. You have to walk neighborhoods and count and do all these other things. Fortunately, the US government and the EU government in the last 3 years have done that work. They've actually commissioned people to actually aggregate. In the US, it's on a census block level, so it's city blocks, and in the EU, it's on a kilometer square level. And so, in fact, this is fairly granular data that doesn't work. That is pretty detailed. It doesn't suffer from a lot of the critiques. But I will say, what I want you to focus on the next slide is not the absolute numbers, because we can quibble them. What we really want is the relative numbers. And both the US and the EU adopted fairly similar methodologies. So unless we believe that the methodology will play out very differently in Europe than it will in the US, then the relative comparison should hold. So what do we find out? In fact, at 25 megabit coverage, which is one of the 2 levels of service that we have, the other one being 200 kilobit per second service, where guess what, we're both at 99.5%. The U.S. has been running substantially ahead of Europe on a consistent basis, and this is the EU proper in the countries. They actually have another data set with 4 additional countries, and what we're discovering is that this has been there's a reasonable assumption here that in fact the imposition of common carriage regulation is a deterring investment, and we can actually look at this a little bit more directly. I actually found an EU government source that provided information about investment. The U.S. is an industry-based source, and they're not perfectly comparable. They count more or less the same things, but I can't actually vouch for some of the methodologies as clearly. But what you see on a per-household basis is that the U.S. has consistently invested 2 to 2.5 times more than European carriers. And what's fascinating is this holds if you look at it on a per-subscriber basis or on a per-capita basis. In general, there's a pretty persistent group, and the problem is that infrastructure sharing means that if you take a risky investment and you doesn't pay out, you'll be left holding all the losses. If you make an investment and it pays out, it must be shared with your competitors at cost, and in fact at replacement cost, not your historical cost. And this has created a deterrent for investing in high-speed. This has been the theory, and what we're seeing is now finally evidence in a wide range of empirical studies that this is actually deterring investment in higher speed architecture. So here's the trade-off. So we would love to have the perfectly competitive outcome. That's not possible, so we're really left with a choice between regulation and non-regulation. And there's a wonderful article by Howard Shalansky in the Yale Journal on Regulation. He is the former chief economist of the FCC under the Clinton administration. He's been the head of the chief economist of the Federal Trade Commission. He's also a law professor. And during the current administration, he's currently heading what's called OIRA, which is the regulatory watchdog organization in the White House. He said, when you're comparing unregulated monopoly with regulated monopoly, go with regulation. Why? Regulation is costly, but unregulated monopoly performs so badly that it's worth going in. But he said, at some point, unregulated oligopoly performs better and better and better. And at some point, the costs of oligopoly are higher than what benefits you get from going in from regulation. And he said, regardless of what your number is, there has to be a number out there at which this flips. And that's the way we should think about this on an optimization basis. And frankly, his number was 3. And so here's a person, he's not a deregulatory free market person at all. He's a fairly reasonable person. And in fact, working for the current administration who's on this, and that's been his historical position. And the other reality to me is that prioritization is quite common in any one of a number of venues and formats that you understand, people in this room understand far better than I do. And so what I would say is that what we see is an overhanging question about whether you'll be able to what extent you'll be able to prioritize service for things like, the VoLTE trials are incredible, but it's basically unreserved bandwidth. It's what we call a specialized service, and it's only accessible to one application provided by one provider. And that's the problem that we haven't been able to sort out yet, and it's one of the overhanging liabilities questions hanging out there. Okay, so this is what I mentioned earlier. Perhaps the biggest change in the current regime is a redefinition of the scope of the open internet order. And this is largely at the behest of a couple of edge providers who've been very vocal and very influential in the space, who are actually it's no longer wants the open internet to be about how traffic is treated within the network. They now want to equalize the terms under which traffic arrives at a network. That is, equalize traffic passing through the entire network. And in fact, the preferred solution for these providers, and this is one they're pushing very hard for, is what they call a zero-price interconnection, which is mandated, uncompensated peering. And this would be in all links in the network, and they're trying to push this throughout the network, certainly to the last-mile providers. And this has become a big problem, which is what's fascinating to me is I just don't understand when we have roughly 45,000 networks currently interconnecting through arm's-length transactions, with packets traveling by different paths through the network, the idea that similarly situated traffic should arrive on the same economic terms with the same latency, I simply don't understand what that means without a radical reconfiguration about how networks connect with one another. The other thing is, there's a pretty interesting economics called the economics of two-sided markets, but well, think of it this way, it's bargaining in some sense, which is, if you're connecting with a person on a settlement-free basis, you've got some sort of ratios or volume metrics, and one person starts radically changing the value or the number of volume they're giving to you, the answer is that you're going to say, well, you need to provision some more links or route your traffic some other way because this is no longer an equitable trade. We're no longer in a balance. And what's fascinating is the other side would say, no, you have to continue to give that to us on a settlement-free basis. And the hard part about this is, the accusation, for example, is the way this usually comes up is Netflix accuses Comcast of allowing its connections to degrade in order to achieve a better bargaining position. Actually, that is a completely true statement. Because if you're on an even exchange and you're getting roughly equal service in both directions and one side radically changes it, the answer is you're feeling like, yes, you need to redo this. And so, yes, you are intentionally refusing to provision more bandwidth in order to get a better economic deal, or what I would consider at some point has to be acknowledged as a fair economic deal. What worries me is introducing government regulators into what has been a fairly effective bargaining situation, hard-nosed, brass-knuckled, business-oriented bargaining. But the problem is if you shift it to a regulatory context, it now becomes about not who's made the investments and who's working hard, but who's got access to the regulators. And the other problem is at a minimum, just by the dates, a decision is 9 months. And that's under good circumstances. And in fact, what we have is a big concern about how that would turn out. This would be a big change that goes beyond anything we even discussed in 2000. That's my presentation. If you're interested, there are a couple of published versions of this. They're much longer than engineers and people like that like to read, but if you're interested, that's there. And you should feel free to contact me at my email address as well. And I'm happy to take your questions.
I think we have at least one at the mic.
You were first. Kevin Bloomberg, The Wire.
Sure.
Your neighbors to the north have had a regulated environment for many years. Culturally, we're kind of similar, but we're not that, there's some differences. So I would definitely suggest that people look a little closer to home when investigating regulated frameworks. The hardest thing about a regulated framework is the incumbents look at a scale of years, whereas the internet and technology is generally in months. And regulators are not set up for the speed of technology changes, at least what I've seen over the last 10 years. That is the hardest part. Finally winning regulation pricing, as an example, on dial-up doesn't help anybody. Or T1s, or things that are no longer technology relevant. And that's probably the hardest thing today, is making sure that if you are going into a regulated environment, that you are getting access to the technology both today and tomorrow.
So the Canadian comparisons are wonderful. I've actually done some work on that and then sponsored some conferences. Canada never had a breakup. And in fact, never broke up AT&T. They never broke up Bell Canada. And in fact, they ended up in a very similar economic condition. What's fascinating is actually the Canadian regulators decided not to regulate open internet because they decided some of the other backdrop regulation they had in place made that unnecessary. What is fascinating, so it's hard to compare them in some ways, but what I would say, to go back to the first slide, is basically the default is this is going to be regulated in this way, an ex-ante prescriptive way. And you have to go to the agency to ask for what's called forbearance. The thing that worries me about that is it reverses the presumption that we've had, is that the presumptive answer, the default answer is yes, you can do it, until there's a proven to be a problem, then someone will step in and make you stop. I've always supported some form of open internet regulation, don't get me wrong, but I would like it to happen to demonstrated problems based on evidence, not on speculated problems, where you imagine everything that could go wrong and set up a regime. The problem I have is in the form where you're required to go do forbearance, if you want to do something different that technically violates the rules, your default answer, but instead of yes, is now no, until you convince a regulator otherwise. And so I would think that what we're fighting over actually is the form of the enforcement mechanism more than the existence of an enforcement mechanism.
Hi, Patrick Gilmore, Markley Group. I'd like to point out that is not Akamai, that's Markley Group. So Specifically, your last set of comments was important because you say things like Netflix and you use them. I'm just using them because you did. Netflix suddenly dramatically changed how much traffic it was sending to Comcast. If I'm Netflix, and I've never worked for Netflix, and I don't work for Netflix now, but if I am Netflix, I'm thinking I spent billions taking this in, billions paying for this content. Your users dramatically changed the request that they sent to me. And going back to one of your other points about oligopoly being unregulated at 3 is better than a regulated monopoly. Well, Comcast is a monopoly because especially if you look at that 25 megabits you put up there, less than half the United States has more than one choice at 25 megabits. So now I look at it from the other direction. Instead of saying, well, Comcast is suddenly getting a whole bunch more, obviously they're going to change the rules so that they can get an economic benefit out of this. Netflix is looking at it as a monopoly just changed the rules because they did something to me. They asked me for a lot more. I'm giving it to them for free. It cost me a lot of money. And I have competitors out there because the switching cost from Netflix to Hulu or iTunes is 0. Whereas the switching cost from Comcast to somebody else, at my house anyway, is infinite since there is no one else. I'd have to literally trench the road. So I think that at least to me, that put it in a totally different frame. And it's amazing how you're standing up there going, well, I actually think regulation in some cases is good. And you ended your talk with, see, Comcast should lower the amount of links they have to Netflix so they can get an economic benefit.
I didn't say they should lower them. I said that they paid for a certain number of links. Well, let's back up. A couple things, what I would say. First, Netflix is a fantastic company. And if you see the roller coaster ride where they've been on, they were at 14 bill, they dropped down to 1. Now they're riding at about 25 because of investments they've made in content, billions of dollars in forward contract. And if the reason they have bargaining power in this space is because of those investments, then they deserve every ounce of bargaining leverage it gives them. The second thing I would say is, in fact, they are going to network providers and deploying their own CDN. And in fact, stuff they used to get paid to pay people to terminate, they're saying, guess what? My content is so popular with you, you're going to start terminating this for free. And you know what? Again, if that's because they've created a great product, which they have, more power to them. Don't get me wrong. Now, I would step back. Another way you can look at this is, this all happened when Netflix changed transit provider. When they were using other transit providers, they had no problems with this. And so, in fact, what you can think of is, this is an endogenous choice that, in fact, they were looking for a...
Factually incorrect.
Well, anyway, it's interesting. So I don't want to get into an argument over the facts, in the sense that...
You're entitled to your own opinion, not your own.
I'm happy to discuss an argument over facts in a different venue, because this is not exactly a way, one that's greatly conducive to it. And in fact, I hope we do get to the facts. One of the interesting things, I'm relying primarily on Dave Clark's MIT study of the behavior and change of the transit links, the 3 primary transit links between Netflix and Comcast.
Let's go ahead and talk
But
about this afterwards.
I agree. That's what a database thing. I'm not trying to duck the data. In fact, I think the data is absolutely critical. But set that to one side. The question to me is, what is going to be the better mechanism where, in fact, we're going to have to get in a conversation like this over figuring out what a fair interconnection rate would be. And on some level, we have 2 choices. We have bilateral negotiations, and we have, right now, the FCC. And this is about, you're all here to make up your own minds, but that, if you want to frame the discussion, that is the one. Neither one's going to lead to a perfect outcome, and if we're looking for a perfectly fair outcome, that's not going to happen. The key is, the question is, which one's going to get closer to the outcome and create a world in which we'll get the dynamics we're looking for.
No argument.
All right.
Hi, Dave Temkin, Netflix. Yes, Chris Libertelli says hi.
Oh!
I believe he's watching the webcast. So you extolled the virtue of a two-sided market in, I think it was your second to last slide.
Yep.
But almost to Patrick's point, how is it a two-sided market if the consumer has no choice, right? The consumer cannot choose a different service. At that point, it seems very one-sided in that, in your example specifically, or Patrick's example, Comcast offers service. They have no choice but to get that service if they want a defined version of broadband. How is that a two-sided market? Aside from calling up Comcast and threatening to cancel to get some incentives to stick around for another year, that certainly seems like a one-sided market to me.
Well, okay, two-sided markets are a very technical term.
Sure.
It's a form, and in fact, really what you're talking about is the terminating access monopoly, which is an independent problem from the two-sided market. The two-sided market is a version of what I would call, a very specialized version of what we call network economic effects. Network effects, for all of us who lived through the VHS beta thing, it's like either one was fine. What we really wanted to know is what everyone else was going to adopt.
Yep.
We wanted the value as being part of the largest network. And in fact, what we discover in two-sided markets, the value is determined not just by the number of people in the network, but you divide the network into two classes, and it's the number of a particular kind of, the other kind of actor. So the easy example that we always make for laugh is if you look at a singles bar for presumably heterosexuals, you don't care the number of people in the bar, you care the number of the people of the opposite sex. And so the value is not based on the total size of the network, but the size in the other class. The classic example of this is advertisers care not about the total size, but you divide the network into advertisers and viewers, and you care about the size of the viewers. And in fact, you get a very interesting dynamic that goes through there. And credit cards between card holders and other places. This is the question is, clearly advertising-based parts of the network, advertising businesses have traditionally been regarded as two-sided markets. What the economic result suggests is two things, is that there is no logical or no theoretical way of who should be paying whom. Sometimes the money should be flowing this way, sometimes the money should be flowing that way, and it's hard to say ex ante that there's a distinctive way the money should flow. The second thing that's kind of funny, and if you want a motivating example, okay, this is about the way the money should flow. In broadcast television, we had the CBSs and the ABCs and the NBCs of the world creating networks, and we had local television stations who were the last mile distributors. Back in the day, the networks paid the broadcast stations to be part of the network. Now, they weren't doing that out of charity. They were an advertising-based business. Having broader connectivity, receiving the advertising was good for them because they'd make it back in advertising revenue and then some. Now, what happened was they used to pay them all the same thing. They started going to the weak stations and say, guess what? You don't reach nearly as many customers as these other people. You're going to have to take less. And they went to the really weak stations. They're going to say, you either have to invest more in your facility or you're going to have to pay us to stay part of the network. And what I hope to do is to get people fighting by making investments to improve their bargaining position. And that's the dynamic we're seeking to unleash that I think Netflix is the perfect example of, that they actually have done those investments, and it has increased their bargaining position in a lot of different places. The problem is that when you start to do this, one of the odder things about two-sided markets is anything that makes something profitable on one side of the market lowers the prices on the other side. Why? If advertising became more profitable, it's better for CBS to subsidize more because they'll make more money. And so what you end up is this very odd set of dynamics, which is called the seesaw principle in the literature, that is very, very hard to unravel, and it's very, very hard to make general things, oh, the money should be flowing this way or that way. In fact, the literature says exactly the opposite. You cannot say ex ante which way the money should be flowing or if there should be zero and no money flowing at all. And so it's all about, you have to get the numbers and make it work.
Absolutely. And, I'm not going to rehash the question. I think you got it in that when I try to use two-sided market, I'm talking about the larger ecosystem, not just a consumer paying for just their broadband service. But, and they do a lot to teach us about network effect at Netflix, for example, because it's certainly a great example. But using the VHS or beta example, in my opinion, is not really true to what the market is doing at this point. At that time, you're right, consumers had a choice. They could pick VHS or beta. Most of us would agree in the room that beta was actually a superior technology, but didn't win, didn't get ubiquitous, hence it lost out on the network effect. But the point is, consumers had a choice between two potentially equal or better products. They chose the lesser one, but they were able to make that choice. Thank you.
So it is important to isolate the different problems because the fixes for each one are completely different. So what I would say is if you look at the two-sided market literature, just the two-sidedness of it, it does not depend on whether the one side is a monopoly or not. The two-sided effect it still exists regardless if it's a monopoly or competitive. Because it's a fact, it's about the demand elasticity on either side to the other side of the market, which is fancier than I want to say, but you have to do that analysis. Now, there is a separate discussion about a terminating access monopoly in the places they charge. That has to be analyzed separately. But in fact, there are some models that suggest that, in fact, there are some welfare benefits in an odd sort of way. Sometimes in a two-sided market analysis, if one side is a monopoly, you have to just look at how the defects are and whether they balance each other out.
Thanks.
I'm just going to close the mics after those two folks standing here to make sure we stay on time. Thanks.
Jeff Houston, APNIC. I'm not from the US. And when you started that talk, you actually mentioned that the US was almost anomalous in not treating particularly local access as part of a regime that was in the spirit of common carriage, if not by the letter. And then you point out all of these wonderful reasons why this anomalous position leads to so-called better outcomes. Why is the rest of the world insane in not following what you're following? Or is there something else going on? Because the outcomes are not all that different. The price I pay is not much different to the price you pay. The amount of broadband infrastructure is roughly equivalent. And in both markets, local access is a monopoly because those markets are sub-additive. And the barriers to a second competitive entry are so high that in every single case it becomes an access monopoly, and those monopolists in an unregulated market extract monopoly rental for access to those users. Is it better to have your national telecommunications policy decided by courts of appeal and judicial process, or a deliberative process of public policy? Which do you think is better?
Again, I would say that neither one is perfect. And in fact, if you look at the history of US telecommunications regulation, through Carter phone, through the breakup of AT&T, and through all these things which we think are the models, they are examples where the FCC was essentially captured by the incumbent industry and the courts forced them to liberalize. So there's a tendency to say, oh, agencies are democratic, courts are not. And what we've learned is that, in fact, courts are politically appointed. Legislatures are not perfect distillants of public will, and that, in fact, they're all flawed institutions, just flawed in different ways and different degrees. And that our game has now become one to put them in dynamic tension with one each other so they cover each other's flaws. And in fact, I would say that it is not at all clear to me that the FCC's track record in network regulation has consistently been something to uniformly celebrate. They've had some very successful things. I think actually declaring this to be outside of traditional common carriage regulation is one of them. They've had a number of situations where they've done actually very badly, and that in fact the primary mover to make them justify what they're doing is in the public interest has been the courts. So I would say there is a role for the courts here that's very positive. I'll back up and say one other thing. I started off with a hook to try to get the talk going. It is an oversimplification. One of the things I'm also doing is I'm studying Pacific Rim countries who are on a government subsidy model that is very, very different than the ones in the rest of the world. That is very much open to public debate too. And I've run some numbers. I'm happy to share them with people who want to talk, but it's not quite ready for prime time yet. But I think they're instructive.
Hi, Dave Diaz, Basilic Access. I realized as I walked up here, this is my 21st year of attending NANOG and doing networking, and this is an old argument. I've worked for the RBOC, I've been CTO of what's now Cogent, I've been subpoenaed by the DOJ during telecom mergers twice, and actually I looked over and I see Bill Norton. We spoke about this on a panel in 1998 at ISPCon. And so the talk about who owns what and who pays what, and what if the content people get together and make a little coalition and go after and say, we're going to de-peer you guys unless we have open and free peering. One interesting fact, I think Dave Temkin hit on it, and a lot of people are upset about, is that my former clients, and they're former because they no longer really exist, Northpoint, Covad, Rhythms, Blue Star, I mean, these were DSL companies. We had options in the last mile. Many of us might choose a more expensive option because we want, you know, public IP space or whatnot. We have no option. I mean, I certainly don't. In several of my locations, I know people that don't. If it's not good at Bill's house, he's sort of stuck with, you know, maybe LTE. But the issue is, if we had an option, we might pick a different one and get beneficial access to the content, or direct, let's say high-speed access to Netflix. That would encourage the Comcasts and whatnot to perhaps do more open peering. One issue I think we all have is that these people didn't build the network without some kind of benefit, in that they got rights of ways given to them by some government, whether it was the munis or whatnot. They've also fought to prevent munis from building their own fiber networks. So I think some of the frustration here, and Patrick certainly is very respectful, even if he sometimes doesn't come across that way, means to say that if we had a choice and one choice was bad, we would pick the second choice, which would encourage the first company to perhaps change their policy. Right now, there is no choice, so hence why Dave is upset that, or not so upset, but what's the encouragement? Where do we go from here? How do we open up? Why isn't regulation, at least at the last mile, the answer? Or going back to the rules we had maybe when we had competition with the North Points, COVADs, and Rhythms?
So first, it is an old fight. And what's fascinating to me is, to use a very gross simplification again, there's been an old fight in the space between the net heads and the bell heads. And I do think that the net heads have won almost every round of that fight. I do think the net heads at this point do suffer from a lack of history. And that, in fact, that they have imbued the notion of common carriage with qualities that I don't think it supports. That's been the fundamental point I'd make, what I'm going to make in the talk. So what bothers me most, I think you're right. What bothers me is that's not how we're talking about this issue. If the issue were designing policies that would create more choice in the last mile, I think that's a healthy conversation to have. In fact, the open internet debate is about not preserving, increasing competition in the last mile. It's about promoting innovation and competition in the edge. Now, I do think there's a relationship between the two, but if you frame the issue correctly, I think that you have, on the last mile, you will actually think about policies in a different way. Because all of a sudden, things like how do we create a friendly investment architecture for that allows people to earn return for extremely risky investments? And taking that seriously is an issue that doesn't get framed quite the same way. And in fact, what you see is in other debates, that's just not done that way. So I will accept what you're saying, and in some sense, what the gentleman from Netflix is saying. I just wish, my problem is, that's not how we're talking about this issue. We're talking about promoting edge for its own sake, instead of focusing on what I think is the real policy problem, which is the lack of options in the last mile. But that requires a different set of policy. You talk about Muni, you talk about all these other things, but it's fascinating to me that all of a sudden looking at how we get them to get a fair return and no more is a very different question than what we've been talking about now.
Well, I would think that, I know that the mics are closed and no one else can come up, but I would suggest that would be a lightning talk to have, because I think that there's a lot of people here that'd be very interested in coming up with solutions, or perhaps suggesting regulatory, some kind of process for the last mile. And I think that would probably I agree with you.
The complicated thing is, the standard watchword in competition policy is you're supposed to protect competition, not competitors. In fact, you're supposed to benefit consumers, not competitors. And usually, encouraging particularly competitors is beneficial. But sometimes it's not. And what you'll find in this space is we have to separate the people who are arguing their company's interests and really map onto how that's going to promote things more broadly. And that, I'll tell you, anyone who's been through antitrust litigation, that's very hard to do. But I actually think that is the debate we have to have, which is understanding that, in fact, the consumers benefit from exactly the problem you're talking about, which is not just the edge services, but we need the more investment and the next generation of broadband and the forklift upgrades that we're going to need at some point, that we need to create an environment which that's possible as well, and that yields consumer benefit as well. It has to be balanced between the two.